So welcome everybody. If you want to move up, it looks like we didn't come close to filling the room, but it's up to you. Why don't you flip it? So I'm that guy, he's the other guy. We're co-chairs of the VMware SIG. We're engineers with the Cloud Native Apps Business Unit at VMware. I've been working on Kubernetes before I joined VMware, so I became active in the Kubernetes storage SIG back in 2015. Fabio?
So I've been at VMware for like 6 years now. I've been mostly involved with open source projects when I was at VMware, so I started working on everything that had to do with containers back in 2014. So Docker, Vagrant, more recently Kubernetes. And so if you used Kubernetes or Vagrant or Docker on any of our VMware platforms, there's a good chance that you saw the code I wrote during my years at VMware. So and now Steve and I were chairing this SIG VMware that is basically looking after everything that has to do with running Kubernetes on any VMware platform.
Okay, flip it. So here's the agenda today. First, we're going to start with what's the purpose of this SIG? What do we do? What would you get out of it if you came on board and joined our bi-weekly meetings? Then we'll move into the roadmap of the various activities we have going on within the Kubernetes project. We'll wrap up with where you go to get more information on an ongoing basis after this meeting ends, and how you can get involved yourself, both to contribute potentially as a software developer, but we're also looking for feedback from users who want to give us input on future features, roadmap, help with documentation, help with training materials. This is an open group, and we're just open to all things that would be of assistance to anybody trying to use Kubernetes in any form on VMware infrastructure. Next. So our charter is to bring together members of the community, both users and developers, to help each other use Kubernetes on top of vSphere infrastructure, but also to interact with the broader Kubernetes community. You know, there's a concept in Kubernetes of an abstraction layer called a cloud provider that in theory gives you a situation where you can be portable to multiple clouds, both multiple public clouds and on-prem, and have an app be unable to tell where it's running and just work effortlessly in all these places. Now, I wish I could say that's just going to magically happen, but you have to build that abstraction layer, and as Kubernetes adds features, you want to take advantage of the features without breaking that great abstraction layer. So this is one of the things we're involved with, is keeping active on that, and even as experts in some of these VMware infrastructure technologies, letting people know in the broader Kubernetes architectural planning committees what might potentially be of great benefit, and on the other hand might potentially break things, so that there'd be a lot of rework involved in making sure that existing users don't get bad surprises. How you join, the first step is to join this Google group. Some of these things are gated, where you have to join the group to be able to edit documents, in some cases see the documents. Well, the reason for this gatekeeping is just to protect you from spam. And there have been occasionally unfortunate incidents not in our group, but I've heard in others, of trolls going in there and just putting essentially graffiti in group planning documents, and we don't want that going on. So you do join the group. You can join the Slack as well. I think your first step, I'd recommend the mailing list, just because it's easier to search for old stuff. Slack is great for interactive, like it's 2 in the morning, I might hope somebody's online and help me out. But yeah, beyond a point, there can be so much traffic in there that isn't easily searched, that for many purposes, going in there in the mailing list is a better experience in my opinion, but you're welcome to do either. So that's it. Next. So We've got 4 sponsored projects: the cloud provider, the CSI provider, which is storage, cluster API, and Minikube. And I'll let Fabio take over from here.
Yep. So right now, the SIG has been created earlier in 2019. So I think our first meeting was around March this year. So it's a pretty new SIG. Obviously, we're focusing on everything that has to do with VMware. So as you can imagine, most of our efforts are trying to get to make Kubernetes run best on vSphere, which is, I guess, our the largest install base out there when it comes to VMware platforms. And we also looking after things like Minikube for Fusion and Workstation, so desktop hypervisors and so on. Particularly, we're focusing on these 4 projects right now. So we're sponsoring these 4 projects. Cloud provider and CSI are kind of going hand in hand, and I'll explain that shortly. And now we're joined the Cluster API working group recently that was recently formed. There's a lot of buzz around Cluster API, and there's actually a session on that later today, which I will recommend you to join, and we'll have a slide at the end with all the details. So speaking of out-of-tree components and CSI and a cloud provider, so this is like a brief overview of what's going on inside Kubernetes. So Kubernetes was originally built as like a single repo standalone project where you had everything that was checked in inside the same repo, which is Kubernetes. And this included code that is vendor dependent, so it's cloud provider dependent. So in our case, we're talking about the vSphere cloud provider. There's obviously AWS, there's OpenStack, there's many of those cloud providers that started early on in the Kubernetes history that have been part of the original Kubernetes core repo. This is obviously not something that can scale as the Kubernetes project wants. So around Kubernetes 1.6 timeframe, there was a proposal to have the cloud providers being removed from the core code base into their own discrete repos. And this was how the cloud provider interface was born. So originally we had different. You can see from the schema here, we used to have kubelet running the cloud provider code. Now we have something called Cloud Controlling Manager that is running, and the Cloud Controlling Manager is something that is no longer part of the core Kubernetes repo. And in our case, what we had, and I'm just flipping back one sec, we used to have a cloud provider that was taking care not just of the compute part, but also the storage part. And this is because it was growing organically inside the project, and as features were added and new interface methods were added, we were just adding on top of that. When this out-of-tree move, over time was refined, there was a decision of splitting the two concerns between 2 separate efforts. One is cloud provider for everything that has to do with compute, and then there's CSI, which is a different effort related to storage. So we're basically splitting out from what is the current in-tree implementation into 2 separate, discrete, out-of-tree components. One of them is CSI, and one of them is the cloud provider. So as Steve mentioned before, the cloud provider is basically meant to be something that can abstract the cloud interface, the IaaS interface that is basically sitting below Kubernetes. So the idea here is that you have a YAML file, you have your application, you have your definition, and you can just deploy that same YAML on top of any cloud provider and expect the cloud provider to perform those functions that you are requesting in your YAML file transparently, because there's a driver, there's a cloud provider that performs that for you. So I was saying before, cloud provider used to handle part of the volume functions. Now it's no longer the case. So there's no longer any storage functions inside the cloud provider interface. Everything is handled by CSI. So cloud provider also handles the availability zone support. So as you can specify availability zones inside your pod spec, and the cloud provider will handle that for you at the cloud provider layer. So the status of cloud providers, external cloud providers in Kubernetes has been alpha since 1.6, and it's been moved to beta at some point. I don't remember exactly what version moved it to beta, and it's currently still beta as of 1.13, which was just released. So the idea is that, and this is an effort that is sponsored by a different SIG. There's a SIG cloud provider that is actually sponsoring the move to AutoTree for that interface. So the plan is to have it move to stable or GA, hopefully in a couple of releases, so early 2019. When it comes to storage, I was mentioning the CSI provider. CSI is yet another interesting effort, and Steve has been part of this for some time. So if you want to add some flavor to my explanation, please feel free to chime in. CSI was basically created with the intent of completely abstracting storage functionalities from any container orchestrator that will implement the CSI interface. So it's not something that is strictly connected with Kubernetes. Kubernetes is implementing CSI. And so as far as I know, Mesos is also implementing CSI,
yeah,
right?
the backers of it were the Apache Mesos orchestrator. Docker got involved, as well as Cloud Foundry. So there were multiple orchestrators in the world doing their own storage plugins. And if you're a storage vendor, it's really silly to have to implement these plugins for all these different platforms. So one of the purposes in life of CSI is to make it orchestrator neutral. And if you as a user are using multiple orchestrators in different departments, this might be of great convenience to you because you can potentially share this back end that you're paying an operational and administrative cost on across multiple orchestrators. Even within Kubernetes, you could have a back end support multiple independent Kubernetes clusters. And I think Kubernetes embraced this because they wanted to move certain parts, like the cloud providers and the storage plugins out of tree. One of the real reasons that might not be obvious for why they want to get it out of the common source space is that you can have scenarios where they do a Kubernetes release, which they do quarterly. A bug comes out in one storage provider out of 30 of them, and it needs a patch. But you have to rebuild and retest all of the Kubernetes suite in order to get that out the door. And maybe in the meantime, some other pull requests have been merged. So it basically ties the release cycle where you couldn't patch a storage-related thing that only affected one of 30 storage plugins without releasing the whole of Kubernetes, and that just is not optimal. So by pushing it out of the tree, if some individual storage provider finds some security bug, wants to get a patch out in 2 days, they could do that because by being out of tree, it's independently built, independently certified and tested, and that is a big attribute. Fabio?
Yep, and the fact that you have independent release trains for all these components is obviously at the same time that is happening with the cloud provider that I mentioned before. So everybody is on a different release schedule where we have a single interface that is your contract with Kubernetes, and Kubernetes eventually will run on its own schedule while all the various components will run on their own separate, and the interface, the API is going to be the only thing connecting the two. So the status of CSI in Kubernetes is actually very interesting because the CSI spec just recently reached 1.0. So the version of the CSI specification reached maturity, so the first GA or stable version. And that CSI spec was actually added to and supported and moved to GA stable also in Kubernetes 1.13. So Kubernetes 1.13 is actually including CSI as a stable feature. And is it my understanding that this is going to be the suggested way of handling storage volumes inside Kubernetes from now on, from 1.13 on?
Yeah, so they're suggesting it as the road forward. However, I'd like to point out that Kubernetes has deprecation rules. So at the current point in time, there's no gun to your head saying you just because Kubernetes got released last week, you have to switch over to it. I'd anticipate the in-tree plugin is going to be alive and well for at least a year, right, Fabio?
Yeah, there's a year. So if you look at the deprecation policy of Kubernetes, so right now there's no deprecation notice for the in-tree providers, so they're not at risk of going away. And the guarantee, I think, is like a year from deprecation notice. So whenever Kubernetes core project will decide to issue deprecation notice for the in-tree cloud provider in the in-tree storage portion, it will be a year before it actually will be removed.
And having been in the enterprise space for a while, I know that if I were in the shoes of somebody using it, I wouldn't jump on some new storage plugin release a week after it came out. But that's up to you. You have the option of doing it either way. There are some storage providers that maybe don't have the option because they sort of have locked down new in-tree storage plugins. So you'll find some solutions out there might have to go to CSI ASAP, but on the VMware platform, you're not looking at that situation. You're going to have a pretty wide window where either one will work. I don't know that it's true that you can run them both simultaneously, but then again, I don't know why you'd want to either, right, Fabio?
Say it again.
I don't know that it's possible to run the in-tree and CSI simultaneously in the same cluster, but I'm not sure why you'd want to. But
so there's actually, given that this move is kind of slightly more complicated than moving from in-tree to out-of-tree, because we're actually splitting up between a single core component that did both compute and storage into two discrete components. You can actually run Kubernetes with a mixed version. So you can run Kubernetes with an external cloud provider while maintaining the in-tree cloud provider for storage. There's a flag in kubelet that you can specify to do that. Or you can do something like the opposite, like using CSI, but rely on the in-tree for everything that has to do with compute. It's kind of, it's probably not suggested, but I understand that.
But I guess you can do it. Okay, there you have it. One thing I will caution you with these changes is beware. This applies to all of Kubernetes. They should put sell-by dates on blog articles. And as these kind of architectural changes take place, Google search can readily find you blog articles on this is the way you should do this that are a year or 2 years old, and they're getting somewhat treacherous. So if you're a newbie to using Kubernetes on the vSphere platform, just be on the lookout and be a little skeptical if that how-to is more than a year old. In some cases, the sell-by on these probably ought to be 6 months, but that isn't unique to this. I think that's a universal thing. Anytime you have a project with as much velocity as Kubernetes, with the thousands of merged commits per month, this is what happens.
And when it comes to the status of these two projects inside of SIG, we're actually happy to announce that we just tagged the very first version of both, the CSI provider for vSphere and the out-of-tree cloud provider plugin yesterday. So we have a 0.1.0 version out, which is the first one, which is kind of decently complete as an implementation. So we're suggesting you, if you're running Kubernetes on vSphere, you want to try that out, you're welcome to. If you want to join the SIG to learn more about that or contribute on these two projects, that's even better.
It is new, so we really would encourage you as early adopters to come and join our bi-weekly meetings and give us some feedback on this too, because you're likely to be a pioneer if you're going to choose to go jump on the CSI this week.
Also, feedback is extremely welcome. Like if you cannot commit to the time to actually help out in the project, even if you're trying out. I mean, this is the future for running Kubernetes on vSphere when it comes to platform integration. So this is what you should be looking at if you're running Kubernetes on vSphere today. Obviously, we're not suggesting you to run this in production today, but if you have dev and test clusters, or just your sandbox where you play out with Kubernetes and vSphere, and you want to just try it out, even just giving us some feedback back, creating a feedback loop with people who are actually using this on a day-to-day basis is extremely important, for the status of this project.
Yeah. So this is the breakdown in how to get involved. So we have an overall SIG meeting on bi-weekly intervals, and this is the big picture of all of vSphere on VMware infrastructure. So if you're an end user, definitely come to that meeting. If you have specialized interests, you can drill down. So the cloud provider is that abstraction layer for running on the vSphere hypervisor. So I'd say that those meetings tend to be more developer focused, but like all of Kubernetes, there's nothing hidden here. It's all open source. You're welcome to come up and get involved in those meetings as well. The cluster API thing is something of specialized interest where, you know, this is what composes VMs and kind of bootstraps them up as you're deploying Kubernetes on top of vSphere infrastructure. It might be of great interest if there are commercial distributions that might manage this kind of thing already as part of a commercial distribution. However, if you are building a commercial distribution or you're choosing to go with the pure upstream Kubernetes out of open source and kind of roll your own onto your own data centers, this stuff could be of great value to you. So it's an API for driving the bootstrap. And afterward, you might want to see Doug here, and if Loke's in the audience, we have a few people I notice in the audience who are very active on that project. So hang around and meet them after this session breaks up. On GitHub, this is where the source lives. You're free to do the open source convention of logging issues. However, if you're not sure that it's an outright software bug requiring software changes, you might have a better experience with either joining a meeting, indicating the nature of your problem in Slack or on the mailing list. But that's where the source lives.
Yeah, so first of all, this slide will be available on the scheduling website, so you can download and look at all the links.
Yeah, it's already up there now.
Put there. I just wanted to highlight that we have 3 meetings currently running. So we have our bi-weekly meeting, which is like the main SIG meeting, bi-weekly on Thursday. It's right after the community meeting. So if you're attending community meeting and you have another hour to spare, 45 minutes, just join our call. When you join the Google group that was on the first slide, you will have access to the meeting agendas and all the recordings that you can see in the link here. So if you have any interest of discussing any kind of topics that has to do with VMware and Kubernetes, you can log in there, just add your name to the discussion list, add your name to the agenda, put whatever you want there, and we'll make sure to bring that up at the next meeting.
Yeah, we don't know. We add some elements to the agenda, but you're totally willing to go in there in advance. And if you do it well in advance, we can maybe recruit speakers on whatever subject you were interested in. But feel free to add topics to that meeting agenda for the next meeting in the queue.
And also, if you have anything you want to demo, we're also very eager to see people running VMware and Kubernetes, or maybe using some other tools to manage life cycle of the VMs when it comes to Kubernetes. We'd love to have you do a demo. We actually have, if you look at the recordings, we have some demos, usually running around all the projects that we're sponsoring. Just want to mention that we had last week, we had a meeting where we had a cluster API demo. So if you're interested in cluster API, which is a hot topic right now, make sure to watch the last week recording.
Yeah, I think I see an audience member from SAP who gave us a demo a few months ago of the Gardner project. So we didn't focus on cluster API on this presentation, and this is just because there is a very nice presentation on cluster API on vSphere in AWS coming up today. So I just want to, besides the list here, we wanted to give you a couple of pointers on sessions you attend this week. So today, we have at 3:40 p.m., we have used cluster API to deploy clusters on-prem and in public cloud. And on-prem is VMware. Public cloud is going to be AWS with Loke from VMware and Chris Nova from Heptio. You want to do the rest of the slides, Steve? Sure. Then tomorrow there's the cloud provider SIG. So this is the overall concept of implementing this abstraction layer so that your Kubernetes workloads can't tell what cloud they're on. So what you'd expect at that meeting is every cloud provider shows up. So if you're an end user doing multi-cloud, or maybe you're a developer trying to do a Kubernetes distro yourself that could be hosted anywhere that isn't, locked into some one particular location or kind of technology, that would be of interest to you. We've got the intro to the cloud provider and then the deep dive. Then finally, the VMware SIG has a deep dive that's going to cover advanced features like using availability zones that are supported in the vSphere hypervisor through DRS, the NUMA support features, and advanced resource management that can be performed using vSphere as an adjunct to what's already built into the stack of Kubernetes, your container runtime in Linux. So all of those have some forms of resource governance if you elect to use them, where you would deploy pods that disclose minimal requirements and maximal cutoff limits for things like CPU cores, memory. But it turns out that because some hypervisors like vSphere have been around with a 10-year history of covering those kinds of issues, that they have advanced features that that would allow you to potentially benefit from engaging both of those simultaneously. So this deep dive is going to get into that subject.
And that's a wrap for us. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions, if you guys have any.
Sure.
I'll just yell. So are you looking for chairs to help with SIG VMware that are outside of being VMware employees?
Yeah, we would love, I think, either
Steve,
Fabio,
can you repeat the question for the
okay.
recording?
We were asked if we'd like to have SIG leadership outside of VMware. Right now, both Fabio and I are VMware employees, but we actually would like to see a user voice there. So if you're a user, I'm not sure, I think potentially even another vendor that wants to get involved and actively lead or drive the VMware SIG, we're open to that. So, I think we don't want this to be vendor dominated. I think it's important for both this SIG and all of Kubernetes to get user voices involved. So one or both of us could potentially step away and let some independent third party take over, and we're amenable to that.
Yeah, I mean, everything we're running so far has been, extremely transparent, and we're trying not to be too vendor oriented, obviously. Also because most of the people involved are actually working on open source 100% of their time, so there's no company involvement when it comes to that. But we're actually actively looking for somebody not from VMware to step up as a SIG leader. So
And that's
if you're interested, please reach out to us.
Yeah, I might get killed, but I'm not in VMware sales. I'm an engineer. I might get killed for saying this, but my mission, and I've been told this in my job description, you can stand up, even though VMware has some Kubernetes distros, my job is to support them all. So if you want to run Red Hat OpenShift on top of vSphere, we're doing nothing in this cloud provider. It's our job to make that work and work well. Same thing for Mesosphere DCOS or any other Kubernetes distro. If you, as a user, want to stand that up, or if you as a user want to buy no distro, compile the open source Kubernetes yourself and stand it up on vSphere, we're here to help you make that work and work well. We're not favoring anybody's distros. The goal here is to make them all work. Any other questions?
Yes.
Sure.
You might have a very short answer. Any thoughts about implementing the load balancer interface?
So just review the questions. And it's about implementing load balancer support on a cloud provider. That's an interesting question, actually. We have an issue open to explore options in implementing the load balancer on vSphere. There's a lot of challenges to do that, obviously, because there's no load balancer facility in vSphere. But for example, there is when you run vSphere AWS, because there's ELB that works with VMware AWS. So there's actually
It's easier to do in a public cloud because
Yeah.
usually the public cloud provider is going to have one and only one. But once you go on-prem, I would contend that you don't want to lock out, declare that one load balancer rules them all. That wouldn't be a good thing to do. So, but in the cloud provider SIG, they are talking about both load balancer and ingress, and they're both things that often are one answer in public clouds, but multiple when you drop on-prem.
We would actually love to hear how people are using it today, because we have some of our ideas on that, but we were exploring, various options because I heard that there's people like using things like Nginx to do like the front end load balancer, but they're not obviously integrated with, what is the cloud provider interface today. So we do have ideas, we do have opinions, but we will actually like to hear more how people are actually using it today and see if we can come up with something that can work for most people.
Yeah, go.
Not really a question. Just guessing. You care to comment on Istio?
No, I don't, other than there was an announcement that the companies intend to join. Watch the space is all I've got to say. It's above my pay grade, and something's happening.
So is the question very specific to open source or commercial objects too, as to how people are using load balancers with Kubernetes?
Well, I think when you're running Kubernetes in a public cloud, you use whatever solution the public cloud provider kind of puts a gravity field on. When you go to on-prem, there's a decade-plus history of various commercial load balancers and some open source ones, anything from HA proxy to network equipment vendors. At VMware, I don't think that company wanted to play any favorites. And my experience is that once something got used on-prem, people aren't really wild about switching. So my initial impression is we ought to support them all, but it shouldn't be a huge effort to just make it work in Kubernetes. How we pull that off, I don't know. If you want to come to our SIG and start composing an engineering group to kind of put an abstraction layer around load balancers for on-prem, I think we'd be very happy to participate in that. Or, on the other hand, if you are with a load balancer vendor and you want to come and give a presentation on how to make it work with Kubernetes on-prem on vSphere, we'd be open to giving you a slot.
So because with NSX you could actually deploy and manage the lifecycle of the load balancer along with Kubernetes.
Yeah. So
We have a CNI.
just to repeat, he pointed out that with NSX, that is for those who don't know, that's a VMware product. I hate to push a product because it looks biased. There's other products as well. But yeah, there are solutions that would just work. The key is, can you make it automatic so you didn't even have to lift your little pinky finger to just have it work? Now, I believe that it's true to say that some commercial distributions would bundle some of this functionality, and so it does just work, but it isn't like built into Kubernetes itself.
Which is our goal, in the end we
Yeah.
want to have, the open source version to be able to just work, in most scenarios and not, have to resort necessarily to buy something.
I think maybe we are getting the cutoff here, but we'll be hanging around. So if you want to ask us questions right after this, feel free to take this to the hallway, or I'm in a number of other sessions. I'll be here all week. Track me down. If you can't find me, ask them to find me in the VMware booth or something, and somebody should be able to find me.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.